Okay, guys, this is the second part of the notes on the Civil War. This section's entitled The War in the West. The West at this time was not what we would consider the West today. It's more of the Midwest or even the East. It's the area along the Mississippi River. The North this was an important spot for them because part of their strategy was to take the Mississippi River. And so they could attack the South and block off the South supplies even further. So there's going to be a series of battles fought in what we're going to call the West to control the Mississippi. We're not going to go too in depth on a lot of these battles, but some of the important battles were the Battle of Shiloh, won by Ulysses S. Grant, the Battle of New Orleans and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Natchez, Mississippi, all taken by the Union. Eventually, the Union gets to a place where they only have one major town left in their way of controlling the entire Mississippi River, and that is Vicksburg, Mississippi. And this becomes a very important battle for the Mississippi River in the Civil War. The reason Vicksburg was not taken by the Union earlier is there were high bluffs overlooking the river that gave the Confederacy an advantage. The general in charge for the Confederacy, John C. Pemberton, defended the city successfully for a long time in the Civil War. Eventually, Grant comes in and decides to blockade the city of Vicksburg and not let any supplies into or out of the city. Supplies in Vicksburg eventually run out because of this blockade. The residents wrote that they were forced to eat their horses, their dogs, rats, and even the leather on their boots. And so they were starving. The army was starving inside of this blockade. And so on July 4th, 1863, which was an important turning point in the war, the Confederates surrender Vicksburg and the Union gains control of the entire Mississippi. So this battle was a very important part of the fight in the West and very important part of the Union strategy to take the Mississippi River and close in on the South. Life during the war, we're going to just talk about some general things that were going on. First of all, Abraham Lincoln, the war was not going very well in 1862, and so Lincoln met with his cabinet members to discuss ways to help the war effort go a little bit better. One thing that they decided to do was to free the slaves in the South. Now, this was kind of interesting because, according to the South, Lincoln was not their president. He had no power to tell them anything. And so Lincoln puts out this order. It's called the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a military order, and he only frees slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy. And that's because he did not want to lose the border states that we talked about in the last section of notes, the slave states that stayed with the North. And some people think wrongly that this was the thing that freed all the slaves. It did not. It was meant so that as the Union Army marched through the South, they could free the slaves that they came across. And eventually they're going to start enlisting some of them into the Union Army. This goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. And again, the big question was, does he have the power to do this with the South claiming they are no longer part of the U.S.? So it was a military thing that was meant to help the North win the war. It wasn't about equality or freeing the slaves necessarily. That will come later. So that's the Emancipation Proclamation. African Americans at first were not even allowed to fight even for the North. Eventually, the North allows African Americans to join the Army. They actually allowed them to join the Navy right away. Part of the reason they allowed them to join the Navy was because it was a pretty crappy job sitting on these boats out in the Atlantic Ocean, doing the blockade. Think about how many times like storms roll in and they have to sit on these boats and not a lot of action. And so it wasn't a very prestigious job. And so they allowed African Americans to do that right away. The Army eventually allows them to join in 1862 as the number of deaths in the Civil War begins to mount and they need soldiers. By spring 1863, we have African-American units. The most famous is the 54th Massachusetts. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, that is about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. All in all, about 180,000 African-Americans served in the Union Army. Even though they served, they faced a lot of discrimination. They were paid less. They were in segregated units led by white officers, and then they were often put on the front lines and targeted by Confederate troops. So it took a lot of bravery for African Americans to sign up, and they didn't get a lot of the same benefits that other soldiers did. Each side was having problems in the middle of the Civil War. By 1863, this war had been going on for 2 years, and both sides were feeling the effects of that. In the North, people started speaking out against the war. They would say that this war was going to go on forever. They would basically say, let the South do what they want to do. Let them split away. It's not worth having all these guys die over this. The North passed a draft, which was unpopular, that made people sign up for the military. And the Copperheads, the people who were speaking out against the war, said it's unfair to make unwilling white men fight for the freedom of slaves. So even though the North was not making this all about slavery, some people saw through this and made that argument. In the North, after the draft was announced, riots broke out and blacks and draft officials were targeted. Over 100 people were killed in these New York riots because of this draft. Many of the rioters were poor immigrants, new to the country, and they were afraid of losing their jobs to freed African-American slaves. So the idea that everybody in the North was anti-slavery and wanted to get rid of slavery is not true. I mean, they're rioting and killing people just because they're afraid of the freedom for African-Americans and what that would do for some people. In the South, they're having their own issues. The North's naval blockade was taking a heavy toll. The soldiers don't have enough supplies. The value of Confederate money falls. Prices of food, clothing, and medicine shoot up because, supply and demand. If you don't have very much of something, the stuff you do have is going to cost a lot. They actually ran out of food in many places. One of the places they were having shortages of food was Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy. And in a famous story, the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, actually went out and broke up a riot personally. He didn't want the news of this riot to get to the North because he had these Copperheads in the North saying, hey, we should just quit the war. It's not worth it. It's going to take too long. And Davis knew that if that news hit the North and they found out that the blockade was working, that would not be good for the South war effort. So he literally goes out and tells the people rioting for food to go home. Another thing that caused some argument in the South was a draft was passed, and the way that you could get out of the draft is if you owned any slaves. So if you owned any slaves, your name did not go on the draft to possibly fight. So only the people who are poor, basically. So there's often a saying in war that wars are fought for the benefit of the rich, but the poor are usually the ones fighting, and that was definitely true about this Civil War. The war effort included lots of different people. Really young and really old went to work in factories to replace the workers that went and fought. Women provided medical care for soldiers. Over 3,000 women served as paid and unpaid nurses for the Union. Clara Barton is the most famous. You might have heard of her. She collected medicine and supplies for troops. Today, they have the American Red Cross that steps in times of emergency, and that was based on the idea that Clara Barton started when she was a nurse in the Civil War. Life was especially bad for prisoners of war. Many, especially in the South, were not given enough food. The most notorious prisoner of war camp was in Andersonville, Georgia, where there were 150 deaths per day, many of them from starvation and disease. You can see the person in the bottom right corner. That is a prisoner that was rescued. This person is actually alive, from Andersonville in Georgia. And so the worst thing was probably to become a prisoner of war during the Civil War. Not good conditions. Up until this point, the South was basically winning the war till the middle of the war, about 1863. And so we're going to talk about what happens and what the what the North is able to do to turn the tide of the war. There were a couple of victories, Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg in Virginia. The Confederates win, and they continue to win many of the battles in the beginning of the war, but some problems start to arise. At Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson is shot by his own troops. He eventually dies from his injuries. At this time, Lee decides to kind of break from the Southern strategy, which was to just defend themselves, and he decides to launch an offensive into the North. The reason why is because the South was getting a little desperate. Obviously, this is why they're breaking from their plan to just stay put in the South. They heard that there were people that were criticizing the war effort in the North, so they wanted to break the Union will to fight. They needed supplies. This was a big part of it. If they marched north, they knew they could get more supplies for their army and for the South, and to turn the tide of the war even further in the Confederates' favor. So that's going to be Lee's plan. He comes up with a strategy to attack the North. This becomes the largest battle that's ever fought on U.S. soil. It's the Battle of Gettysburg. It was fought in July 1863 in Pennsylvania. Like I said, Lee marches his troops north. He has about 75,000 men versus 90,000 Union soldiers. The person that was just put in charge of the Union Army in Pennsylvania during this time is George G. Meade. He became the commander of this group 3 days before the battle, and he becomes a hero of this. The most famous event of this is Pickett's Charge. So there was an officer, George Pickett, who led a group of thousands of Confederates on a charge against the Union, and it just goes horribly wrong. And most of his 14,000 troops are killed within a matter of like 30 minutes. And overall, the Confederate Army loses this battle. It's like a 3-day battle. And this becomes the major turning point in the Civil War. It's the last time the Confederates march north into Union territory. They suffer heavy losses. About 28,000 men are either killed or wounded. The battle happens the same day that Vicksburg falls, that we just talked about earlier, the Mississippi River. And this changes the feeling in the North. They believe they can defeat the South. And so this is a very crucial time frame of the Civil War, was in early July 1863. Later on, another thing that you may know about Gettysburg, a few months after the battle, November 19th, 1863, President Lincoln goes to dedicate this battlefield and have a ceremony dedicated to the troops that lost their life. This was the deadliest battle in U.S. ever fought on U.S. soil. And so, they felt it was important to go and talk about the men who gave their lives there. Lincoln gives this speech in the middle of the Civil War. It was kind of criticized at the time. It was a very short speech. It was just a couple minutes long. The speaker before him talked for 2 hours. This was something that people would travel from long distances to go see. Listening to speeches was highly entertaining to people back then. So when Lincoln gets up and only gives 270 words, people thought it was kind of insulting. And now, we call this the Gettysburg Address, and it's considered to be one of the greatest speeches of all time. So the idea about this speech has really changed. And the reason it's considered to be one of the greatest speeches of all time is because he got a ton of meaning into 270 words, probably more meaning into those 270 words than the person before him did in 13,000. And so just considered a great speech for all the important things he was able to say in such a short amount of time. You've probably heard parts of this speech before. It is basically I consider it to be like a coach's halftime speech. He says, okay, so far maybe the war hasn't gone great. We've got this big turning point at Gettysburg. And basically, he says that he can't make the battlefield more important than the soldiers that died already did. The only thing that the Union can do now and he can do now is make sure the North wins the war so that these people didn't die for no reason. And that's part of it. He has some other things he said in there. But very, very famous speech comes out of, the Battle of Gettysburg. At this point, Lincoln gives Grant command of the Union Army. It's 1864. If you remember, the whole reason that Lincoln liked Grant is that he was extremely aggressive. He was an aggressive leader in war. And so Grant goes on something called the Wilderness Campaign, and it was a series of battles in Virginia, 100,000 Union troops versus 70,000 Confederates. The battles themselves were not actually that notable. The main thing, and even the Confederates, they actually won most of the battles. But the thing about these that were different is even though Grant lost many of these battles, he continued attacking over and over and over. And what this was doing is wearing down the Confederate troops and supplies because they couldn't replace their supplies and troops as easily as the North could. So Grant was concerned less about winning the individual battles and more about wearing down the Southern supplies. And that's what Lincoln wanted. And so Grant was a good leader for Lincoln's overall plan for winning the war. As Grant became the leader of the Union Army in the East, a new person was brought in and given command of the Union Army in the West, and that is General William Tecumseh Sherman. He is given specific orders to create havoc and destruction of all resources beneficial to the enemy. All resources, which means he destroys railroads, bridges, crops, plantations. He takes his men and spreads them 60 miles wide so that they destroy more things rather than marching in a straight line. He marches from Tennessee to Georgia, destroying everything in his path. Arrives in Atlanta in July 1864 and holds it under siege until September. Eventually, they run out of supplies. Atlanta falls, and he burns the city of Atlanta to the ground. He continues on to Savannah, Georgia, arriving in December 1864. That is on the coast, so this is called Sherman's March to the Sea. He says to Lincoln that he has a Christmas present for him, and that is the city of Savannah. He's completed his mission, marching from Tennessee to Georgia, destroying everything in his path. This destruction is going to take years and years and years to repair after the Civil War. This is called total war. This is going to be the new way that wars are fought from this point forward, where civilians and their property are targets of opposing armies. While this is going on, Grant forces Lee to retreat from the Confederate capital of Richmond. Lee is kind of on the run at this point, hoping to join up with one last group of the Confederate Army in North Carolina, but Grant, continuing to be aggressive and attack, cuts off Lee's escape route, surrounds Lee, and forces General Robert E. Lee to surrender in April of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. At this point, with the destruction and the inability to get more troops, the South can't really fight anymore, so they surrender and the Civil War is over. Looking back at the Civil War, the low number, 620,000 soldiers died, could be up to 1 million. It is the deadliest war in American history. Much of the South is completely destroyed. Take a look at those pictures there at the bottom. Bitterness over the war and Reconstruction is going to last for many years after. Even today, you still see some signs of kind of the bitterness between North and South, and definitely some of the racial tensions that we still experience in this country can be traced back to this time period. And we'll talk about that in the next unit and why some of these problems were not solved back then. That is your notes on the Civil War. Make sure you're keeping up on that. And if you have any questions, make sure you get a hold of me through email or stop by my Zoom office hours.